The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
Now a quick different take on what happens as technology matures. We've seen now the lineage of visual computing systems and the lineage of GUI systems. I came across an article a couple years ago that I really liked that introduced sort of three phases of technology as it gets introduced. And then I thought, I think there's actually a fourth part to it that was ignored by the original author. And I added that. So I wanted to introduce you to this little model. And that model actually applies to most technologies as they get introduced. And it's basically, it's based on a model by David Little, who, by the way, also wrote the code for the Alto display controller. He was the project lead on the STAR project. He founded Interval Labs and became a venture capitalist. So very influential guy. And he wrote up these, this wonderful little article on on the three phases of technology. He says, as technology sort of is being introduced, let's take, we'll get to examples later. As technology is introduced, you have something that you could call the enthusiast phase. So first, it's made for those people who are really ready to be early adopters, like alpha users, people who are not afraid of the technology and the difficulties that you'll have. We've probably all struggled with like the very first version of some kind of new tech that we just wanted to have, and even though it was kind of buggy and hard to use, we just wanted to make use of it. So it's there to be exploited and to be sort of played around with, and it's not really something that you get to immediately become productive. It's more like for those people who like to tinker with stuff. As technology then matures and becomes more usable, you get to a professional phase where it's usable to get work done, to actually make a business sense. And you could say with the GUI, if you look at it, the very first things like Sketchpad wasn't really a system that you would sit down and build a business around. It was there to be exploited and to be played with. And then the professional phase would have been if you get to like the AltoStar Mac sort of line, where it really became something that you could buy and put on your desk and get something done. And then comes the consumer phase, where it becomes available to the end user. So maybe that's actually where we sort of transgress from or move from the AltoStar model to the Mac, where it becomes something that a lot of people can pick up and just use, even just for fun, right? Those were the three phases that David Little introduced. And I think at the end of those phases, there tends to be what I call the sweet spot, where technology really has reached a relatively seen high point in the increase of productivity, usefulness, and just enjoyment. But unfortunately, you could say, development will not stop there. It will continue because companies want to continue to sell new stuff. So they will tack on additional things to that technology beyond that sort of sweet spot. And yes, it will improve the usefulness or productivity, but more like on a marginal level, like not really fundamentally new and fundamentally life-changing. And then you get into what I call the Baroque phase, where you just add on stuff to continue selling more versions, more updates. And that's where ultimately then usability sort of declines. And I was surprised that David wasn't actually going that way. He was just looking at these first three phases here. Although we often, I think, from a usability point, we see this phase for a lot of products. So let me give you a couple examples here where I think these work out well. Let's take GPS, okay? Navigation in your car. Back in around 97, I think, I bought my second generation PDA, a Cyan PDA. And that PDA looked like a miniature computer. It's this thing back there. And if you really, really wanted to, well, you could install software on that PDA that would give you a, basically a map, right? You could actually plot a track from how do I get from Aachen to Cologne or stuff like this. It would give you instructions and all that kind of stuff. But it wouldn't show you where you are because the PDA didn't have GPS built in. If you really, really wanted to, and you can see I wanted to, you can buy a GPS and attach it with tons of cables to your PDA, and then actually, I had something on my dashboard in '97 somewhere. Well, this was probably more like 2000. where I was able to navigate from A to B, and the system was like giving me written instructions on how to get there. No voice output, that was too advanced. But I had GPS, that was really cool. But installing this probably took longer than the actual drive that I was going to take, right? And you had like a million cables on your dashboard. So clearly an enthusiast phase. If you wanted to play with this, yes, but it wasn't really feasible for anybody on a daily basis. And then the professional phase, of course, quickly fleets of trucks and companies discovered it makes a lot of sense to put GPS navigation systems into the trucks for our drivers, because they're driving 10 hours a day, and they need to know exactly where they're going, and it's money if they take a wrong turn. That's money lost for us. Plus, they're also in these cars for so long that they will learn to use the system. They will have a long learning curve, a lot of time to get used to the quirks and peculiarities of it. So usability isn't that big of a deal because you have enough time to learn how the system works, and you're more interested in the long-term payoff. That's the professional phase. It helps you get work done. Then comes, of course, with GPS, we all know this, the consumer phase. So at some point, the system started to appear that you were able or supposed to be able to use as a consumer. And you can see those look much more compact and not this kind of mess here. And much easier to use, more sort of accessible. Maybe not quite there yet, right? This is still not something that everybody would go like, wow, I want this. And at some point then, sort of the sweet spot appears. And to me personally, I think this was like when the early TomTom systems came out, or others then were building similar things like Garmin and so on. But TomTom had sort of a particularly good approach to usability there, and they just nailed it. You unpack this thing, you stick it to your windshield, you tap on the screen, you enter an address, and you say go, and that's it. You don't even need to read the manual. Very well designed, right? This was a life changer. This changed the way that we remember cities today, right? You can, when you get to a new city, you no longer like mess around with paper maps or like get out a map before you start your holiday to plan where you're driving. You just tap in where you want to go. So that's definitely a life changer. And then, of course, what happened since was that we need to sell more of these systems. So aside from some technical real improvements, there's also a lot of featureitis. Like one version of a later TomTom system actually had a photo slideshow on the device. A photo slideshow for an in-car navigation system. Come on, that's not useful. It's basically there because, hey, we now have a CPU and we have RAM and we can run software on this, so let's build more apps basically. But this was clearly not adding to the navigation experience. It was by far inferior in terms of the added value when you compare it to the actual fact of having an in-car navigation system. One more example, if you look at cell phones, if you basically wanted to, in the enthusiast phase, you basically get a pack of electronics, if you like, if you really wanted to play with GSM technology. Then the the professional phase kicked in when you had those carry inside a box phones that were heavy enough to warrant their own sort of little kit here. This was an early mobile phone. And then things moved into but this was already useful. If you were like a traveling salesperson, this was changing the way you were running business because you'd actually talk to the company back home while you were in your car. And then the consumer phase. People might remember, maybe not, the early Motorola bone kind of phones here. And when that sort of hit its sweet spot, I would say that was probably for the mobile phone, just for calling. It was probably around somewhere like the Nokia 3210. Those kinds of phones that were running for like a week on their charge or 2 weeks, and you could like throw them across the room, and all that would happen was the battery would slide out, and you just put it back together, and it still works. We probably all have one of those still lying somewhere in the back of our drawers, and if you turn it on, the battery it still works. It's amazing. And this changed the way that people were, of course, running their lives, right? If you think about it, back before cell phones, you may not be able to recall this, but before cell phones, you actually had to agree when you wanted to meet somebody where and when you would meet ahead of time, And now it's like, yeah, whatever, callers or texters or whatever, WhatsApp me when you're there, and then we'll meet up. And And I can guarantee you that if people use a cell phone at a rock concert to find each other, that was not what the original inventors of the cell phone had imagined in any way. Right? This was very different. And then, of course, what happened to the cell phone, and I'm talking just about calling, maybe texting, not the million other things we can do with smartphones today, just this key feature for the cell phone itself. We got the Baroque phase, which were these kinds of things, right? Bloated and lots of keys, and you were supposed to tap on tiny little icons here that were hard to hit, and it was trying to do all these things, but it was still trying to be a cell phone, and that didn't really work. And then, what happened after that, of course, is that the iPhone and the whole idea of touch-based smartphones came around that did away with this interface design, did away with this form factor, and changed it into something else. And that sort of resolved this Baroque phase, and that's why this quickly died off after that. All right, so if it might seem difficult to differentiate between what makes something a sweet spot product based on what I think this definition is, and what is the Baroque phase, because both are adding things. Well, for the sweet spot, the thing that it introduced, like the GPS or the cell phone, it really, this is the first time you encounter this technology, it simplifies your life. Right? You can now meet up with somebody without having to think about it before. Baroque phase, the additional features really more like complicate your life. Now you've got all these other things on the system, and you need to figure out how it works, you need to read the manual, all that kind of stuff. The sweet spot also usually has new functionality that changes the rules of the game. It changes the way, in the case of the cell phone, how we interact with each other. In the case of GPS, how we remember maps of cities, how we drive, how we move around a place. And whereas the Baroque phase, it's really more about feature creep, stuff being put in there. All right, so this is a sort of a model that I think is important to understand, and I'd like you in your spare time maybe think about how does that apply to some other technology that you've seen entering your life. Is it in a hobbyist, enthusiast, or professional or consumer phase, or is it actually hitting the sweet spot already, or is it moving into a Baroque?
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.